Before we begin tonight's journey, let me ask you something. When you picture Medusa, do you see a monster with snakes for hair or a tragic woman cursed by the gods? Write your answer in the comments below, monster or victim, and let's see which version of Medusa lives most vividly in our collective imagination. They say there are faces older than the gods themselves, carved into temple stones and pressed onto ancient coins, staring back across millennia with eyes that never close. Among these, none is more haunting than the face of Medusa, a face so feared it was said to freeze men where they stood, yet a face so revered it was carried into battle as a shield. How could one image be both curse and protection? How could one woman be remembered both as a monster and as a guardian? That is the mystery we will unravel. Long before Zeus hurled his thunderbolts or Athena guided heroes, there were older powers, beings born not from order but from chaos itself. Medusa was one of them. She and her sisters, the Gorgons, were the daughters of ancient sea deities, Phorcys and Ceto, creatures of the deep ocean where sunlight never reached. To the Greeks, the sea was both a giver of life and a devourer of men, a place of storms and shipwrecks where whole fleets could vanish without a trace. Out of that fearful element came the Gorgons, their very existence a reminder that nature could never be fully tamed. The earliest Greeks did not tell Medusa's story in words so much as in stone. Archaeologists point us to the island of Corfu, where the temple of Artemis still bears her face. Carved into the pediment in the 6th century BCE, her wide eyes and gaping mouth glare outward, snakes writhing around her head. She is not hidden in shame, not shoved to the margins. She is placed at the temple's heart, watching, guarding. To look upon her, there is to understand that Medusa was never meant to be only a destroyer. She was a threshold guardian, a being whose terrible face kept evil at bay. That same face traveled far beyond temple walls. It appeared on Athenian shields, meant to terrify enemies before the first spear was even thrown. It was stamped onto coins, painted onto pottery, even stitched into the clothes warriors wore beneath their armor. The ancients called this the apotropaic function, the power of horror to turn back harm. In a world without iron walls or gunpowder, terror itself was a kind of technology. Medusa's gaze, reproduced in miniature, became a spiritual shield, and this was not unique to Greece. In Mesopotamia, serpentine women like Lamia were feared and invoked for protection. In Egypt, Isis sometimes took on serpent form to guard sacred spaces. In India, temple doors were watched over by coiled nagas, half-human, half-serpent beings who both threatened and blessed. Across cultures, the snake-haired guardian reappeared, not as villain but as protector of boundaries, the one who stands between the sacred and the profane, the living and the dead. Medusa belonged to this wider family of threshold figures, feared not because they were evil, but because they embodied the raw danger of the world itself. Even her name whispers this truth. In Greek, Medusa comes from Medo, meaning to guard, to protect. Imagine the irony. The figure we now call a monster was once invoked as a shield. To inscribe her face on a soldier's chest was to declare, "Here stands one who cannot be overcome." To carve her image on temple doors was to say, "Evil will not pass." And yet, myths are never fixed. They bend to the power of those who tell them. As the Olympians rose to dominance, and later, as the Romans reshaped the stories to reflect their own values, Medusa's image shifted. She became the only mortal among immortal sisters. She became a woman punished not for her sins, but for her violation. She became the embodiment of monstrous femininity, her serpents a punishment from Athena, her gaze a curse upon the world. In this shift, we glimpse how myth can be weaponized, how a guardian can be rewritten as a monster, how the dangerous feminine can be transformed into an object of fear and loathing. Yet even as the poets told of her as a victim and a terror, her older face still lingered in stone and bronze, staring out from shields and temple walls. It is as if two Medusas existed at once, the demon to be slain, and the protector who stood watch at every threshold. To the philosophers of later Greece, her petrifying gaze was not simply a horror story, it was a metaphor. To look into Medusa's eyes was to confront reality too raw, too direct, too overwhelming for human consciousness. Chaos unmediated, truth unfiltered, and such truth can paralyze. Perseus, as we will see, could not face her directly. He needed the shield's reflection, a lesson in itself. There are truths so powerful they must be approached indirectly, in fragments, in symbols, or they will shatter us where we stand. So who was Medusa really? A monster cursed by Athena, a woman wronged by gods, a primordial guardian older than Olympus? Perhaps she is all of these at once. Perhaps that is why her face still grips us after thousands of years. She was never one thing. She was, and remains, a mirror of what we most fear, the sea that swallows ships, the chaos beyond order, the power of the feminine, the raw truth of mortality. And as we close this first chapter, we are left with the unsettling thought that Medusa, the so-called monster, was never the danger. The real danger lies in how each age chose to see her. The Gorgon as shield. When we think of the Gorgon's face today, we imagine horror, a monstrous mask of fangs and snakes. But to the ancient Greeks, that same face was something far more practical. It was protection. The Greeks believed that certain images had the power to ward off evil, and Medusa's was the most powerful of them all. This wasn't myth as entertainment, it was myth as technology, myth as defense system. To carve the Gorgon's eyes into stone or to paint them on clay was to build an invisible wall around yourself, a warning to enemies both human and divine: turn back or be destroyed. The Greeks called this apotropaic power, a magic of reversal, the belief that by displaying a terrifying image, you could send terror back upon whatever threatened you. Medusa's head became the most potent apotropaic symbol of all. Archaeologists have uncovered her grimacing face on temple lintels, staring down from rooftops, etched onto doorways, staring out from coins, and even hidden inside the private belongings of households. To a villager, to a soldier, to a priest, the Gorgon's mask was no mere decoration. It was a talisman. And there was strategy in the horror. Her bulging eyes were always wide, never blinking, so that no evil spirit could sneak past unnoticed. Her tongue was thrust out in defiance, mocking any intruder. The serpents around her head were not random ornamentation, but living symbols of rebirth and death, a constant reminder of the cycle no one could escape. To carry Medusa into battle was to carry chaos itself, turned outward against the enemy. Imagine the line of hoplites, shields raised, each one bearing the Gorgon's face. Before the clash of bronze even began, fear had already been summoned as a weapon. But Greece was not alone in this. Across the Mediterranean and the Near East, cultures shared a belief that the grotesque could protect. In Mesopotamia, the figure of Lamia, half serpent, half woman, stood as both nightmare and guardian. The Egyptians placed coiled serpents and fearsome gods at doorways to ward off the forces of chaos that prowled the desert. In India, temple entrances were, and still are, guarded by Nagas, serpent beings whose gaze promises both death and protection. Wherever humanity built sacred spaces, the serpent appeared, guardian, threshold keeper, silent warning. Medusa was simply the Greek incarnation of this much wider tradition. But what set her apart was the intensity of her image, the way her face pressed directly into the imagination of a people constantly negotiating with the dangers of sea, plague, and war. For the Greeks, Medusa was not a character locked in a storybook. She was present, daily, watching over homes, markets, sanctuaries, and armies. She belonged not only to the world of heroes and gods, but to the rough, real texture of ordinary life. Even her head alone, the severed Gorgonion, carried power after death. The myth says Perseus strapped it to his shield, using it to freeze his enemies in terror. But outside myth, Greeks and Romans alike used the same head in their own defenses, carved into breastplates, helmets, and city walls. Death itself could be made into a weapon. The Gorgon's gaze could still protect, even when cut from the body. Think about what this tells us about ancient minds. They lived in a world where illness struck without warning, storms shattered fleets, and enemies raided from beyond the horizon. They needed protection, and sometimes steel or stone were not enough. They turned instead to images, not gentle ones, but images so fearsome that evil itself would tremble. That is why the Gorgon's face endures, not as a fairy tale, but as one of the oldest, most enduring shields in human imagination. And yet, this was only one layer of Medusa's story. Soon, poets and priests would transform her. Soon she would shift from protector to victim, from guardian to monster. The face that once shielded humanity would be retold as a curse. And it is in that transformation that we see the power of myth to protect, to terrify, and to rewrite itself across generations. From guardian to victim stories live many lives, and Medusa's story is no exception. What began as the face of protection slowly darkened, reshaped by poets who needed her to play a different role. By the time the Romans inherited Greek mythology, Medusa was no longer simply a guardian. She had become a victim, and then, cruelly, a monster blamed for her own suffering. The turning point comes in Ovid's Metamorphoses. In earlier accounts, Medusa was terrifying by nature, born that way from primordial parents. But Ovid changes everything. In his telling, Medusa was once a woman of extraordinary beauty, her hair so radiant it drew the attention of the gods themselves. It was Poseidon who pursued her, not in love but in violence, cornering her inside Athena's temple. What followed was no union, but assault, a desecration of the sacred. And yet, when Athena discovered what had happened, she did not punish the god who had violated her sanctuary. Instead, she punished Medusa, twisting her beauty into horror, her hair into snakes, her gaze into stone. This shift is as revealing as it is tragic. In Ovid's Rome, a woman's virtue was measured not by her own choices, but by how well she preserved her chastity in the eyes of men. If she was violated, the shame was hers to carry, not her attackers. The myth reflects the cold logic of Roman law and society, where women were held responsible for the violence inflicted upon them. Medusa became a symbol of victim blaming so deeply embedded that it took divine form. And yet, there is a quiet defiance in Ovid's version too. By transforming Medusa into a monster, Athena did not make her powerless. She made her untouchable. From then on, no man could approach her without risk of being turned to stone. The violation had turned into a weapon, and Medusa herself became a boundary no one could cross. Was this cruelty from a goddess jealous of her temple's desecration? Or was it a twisted form of protection, making Medusa unassailable to mortal touch? The poets never answer, but the ambiguity lingers. What we do know is that this story marks the beginning of Medusa's long association with punishment, with the dangerous feminine. In earlier centuries, she was carved on temples to keep chaos away. Now, she herself became the chaos that needed to be slain. The same face that once protected Greeks on the battlefield was recast as the ultimate enemy a hero must overcome. In the space of a few generations, Medusa was rewritten from shield to scapegoat. This transformation tells us something fundamental about mythology itself. It is never just entertainment, it is a mirror, reflecting the values and fears of the society that tells it. When Greeks needed protection, Medusa was their guardian. When Romans wanted to enforce their laws and their hierarchies, Medusa became a warning of what happens to women who transgressed, even unwillingly. Myth became morality tale, and morality tale became justification for power. And so, Medusa the protector vanished into Medusa, the cursed. It is this version, the victim punished, the monster created, that survives most vividly in our imagination. But beneath it, the older Medusa still waits, staring out from broken temples and weathered coins, reminding us that no story is ever told only once. Eyes that turn to stone. The most enduring part of Medusa's legend is not her origin, nor even her death, but her eyes. The gaze that could turn the living into stone is perhaps one of the most chilling images in all of mythology. But what does it really mean for a glance to petrify? Was it simply a terrifying flourish to make her monstrous, or does it reveal something deeper about how the ancients understood fear, truth, and even death itself? The earliest tellings describe the gaze as absolute. Anything that looked upon her froze instantly, whether beast, warrior, or even the gods themselves if they dared. To the Greeks, stone was not just lifeless matter, it was permanence. To be turned into stone was to be trapped forever in a single moment, stripped of motion, change, and breath. The gaze was more than death. It was eternal paralysis. And yet, as strange as this power seems, echoes of it exist in the world the ancients knew. When a villager stumbled upon a body long preserved in peat bogs or desiccated by desert winds, what did they see? A corpse that looked almost alive, suspended between life and death, as if caught in the act of breathing. Archaeologists studying taphonomy, the science of decomposition, tell us such discoveries were common in ancient times. To a people without microscopes or scientific explanations, these preserved bodies must have looked like victims of a supernatural gaze, life halted mid-motion. Philosophers gave the gaze their own interpretation. Plato spoke of truth as something so blinding that the soul could not look at it directly. Later thinkers compared Medusa's power to that confrontation. Her eyes were the unbearable vision of reality itself. Look straight into chaos, and you will be paralyzed. Only with mediation, reflection, or preparation could the truth be endured. Medusa's glance was thus a kind of cosmic metaphor, a reminder of the limits of human perception. But there was also something celestial in her legend. High in the night sky, in the constellation Perseus, there is a star called Algol, its Arabic name meaning the demon star. To the Greeks, it was the eye of Medusa, a star that seems to flicker and fade every few days. Today we know it is an eclipsing binary, one star passing before another, but to the ancients it was the blinking of Medusa's deadly eye, casting misfortune on anyone born under its light. Even the heavens carried her myth. To those who feared her, the gaze was destruction. To those who studied it, the gaze was transformation. Mystery religions whispered that to be turned to stone by Medusa was to undergo a symbolic death, the first step towards spiritual rebirth. To stare into the terror of mortality and survive was to be remade. The gaze, then, was not just a curse. It was initiation. But of course, not everyone could endure such a confrontation. For most, the petrifying power remained a horror, the ultimate weapon of isolation. It is no wonder that Perseus, when he set out to kill her, was told not to meet her eyes at all. He would need a mirror to face her, not his own courage, and in that detail lies a hidden lesson. Some truths are too overwhelming to meet directly. They can only be seen in reflection, glimpsed indirectly, or they will freeze us in place forever. Medusa's eyes remind us that horror in myth is never just fear for its own sake. It is always pointing to something greater, to the paralysis of trauma, the weight of truth, the inevitability of death, the danger of the sacred. To be turned to stone by her was to come face to face with all the things humans could not bear to look at, and so her eyes, more than her snakes or her story, became her legacy. They are why she terrifies, why she protects, why she endures. The face may shift, the myth may change, but the gaze of Medusa, unblinking, merciless, eternal, continues to look back at us from the oldest fragments of stone and the deepest recesses of our imagination. Perseus and the tools of strategy. When heroes in Greek myth set out to slay monsters, they usually carried swords and courage. But Perseus, the one chosen to face Medusa, was given something different. His quest was never about brute strength, it was about strategy, wit, and the right tools. To stand against a creature whose eyes could paralyze armies, muscle alone would have been useless. What Perseus carried instead was a collection of gifts, each one a symbol, each one a lesson in how to confront danger that cannot be faced directly. The gods knew this was no ordinary mission. Hermes, the guide of souls, lent him winged sandals so that he could cross boundaries of earth and sky. Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war, gave him a polished bronze shield that gleamed like a mirror, a device as much intellectual as martial. Hades contributed his cap of invisibility, allowing Perseus to slip past what could not be fought head-on. And from the god Hephaestus came the sickle of adamant, sharp enough to sever even the immortal coils of a Gorgon's neck. But these were not just weapons. Each was a metaphor wrapped in myth. The sandals were swiftness of thought, the ability to move where ordinary steps could not go. The shield was reflection, the indirect path to knowledge and survival. The cap was concealment, the wisdom of knowing when to remain unseen. And the blade was precision, the power to strike only where it mattered most. Together, they formed not just a hero's kit, but a kind of philosophical code: intellect, reflection, invisibility, precision. When Perseus approached Medusa, he did not rush in with sword raised. He advanced carefully, shield turned outward, eyes fixed not on her, but on her reflection. To see her directly was death, but to see her indirectly was strategy. This moment has been interpreted endlessly by philosophers and poets. Was Perseus a hero, or was he simply clever enough to avoid looking too closely at the truth? Some suggest the story teaches that certain realities must be approached obliquely, through metaphor and symbol, or they overwhelm us. The mirror is not cowardice, it is wisdom. What makes the story even more fascinating is how it echoes rituals of initiation. In many mystery cults, the initiate could not confront the divine directly. They needed masks, intermediaries, layers of symbolism. Perseus with his shield becomes the initiate, facing the overwhelming presence not by direct confrontation but by careful mediation. He succeeds because he respects the danger. When at last he struck, the cut was swift and final. Medusa's head fell, but her power did not vanish with her body. Even severed, the head retained its gaze, its petrifying strength. Perseus placed it in a sack and carried it with him, wielding it as a weapon against those who stood in his way. In myth, it became the ultimate apotropaic object, protecting him just as it had once protected temples and shields. The lesson was not simply that he killed a monster, but that he harnessed her power, redirected it, made it his own. Perseus's triumph is usually told as the victory of heroism, but when you look closer, it feels more like a parable about survival through cunning. He was not stronger than Medusa. He was prepared, equipped, and careful. He turned danger back on itself. The gods did not hand him weapons to destroy. They gave him tools to navigate what could not otherwise be endured. And in that, the myth speaks across the centuries. Sometimes we cannot meet fear head-on. Sometimes we survive by reflection, strategy, and knowing exactly where and how to strike. And so Perseus left the cave carrying not only Medusa's head, but also the proof that intellect and cunning can triumph where strength fails. His story is remembered as a conquest, but perhaps it is really about something far subtler, the art of facing the unbearable, not by charging into it, but by learning to look without looking. Medusa in mystery cults and esoteric traditions. If Medusa lived in the temples and shields of the everyday Greeks, she also haunted the deeper, hidden corners of their spiritual life, the secret rites, the mystery cults, the ceremonies whispered rather than spoken. For the uninitiated, she was a monster to be feared. But for those who sought initiation into the mysteries of life and death, Medusa was something else entirely, a guide to transformation. In the Eleusinian mysteries, the most sacred rites of ancient Greece, initiates were led through rituals that symbolized death and rebirth. We cannot know the details. Secrecy was absolute, punishable by death, but scattered hints suggest that terrifying images, masks, and symbols were part of the journey. To confront fear was to be purified. And what image could embody fear more perfectly than the Gorgon's face? The initiate who faced her did not meet destruction, but rather a kind of spiritual petrification, a symbolic death that stripped away the old self so that a new one might be born. Orphic traditions hinted at similar patterns. The Orphics believed the soul was trapped in cycles of death and rebirth, needing purification to return to its divine source. Medusa, with her gaze that could stop life in an instant, became a symbol of that boundary. She was not just a monster slain by a hero, but the personification of the threshold itself, the moment between living and dying, between ignorance and revelation. Later, in the esoteric traditions of Hermeticism and alchemy, Medusa's image took on even stranger depths. To the alchemists, the blackened stage of transformation, the nigredo, was the necessary first step before gold could emerge. Medusa's stare, which froze and destroyed, was also the gaze that dissolved the false self, preparing the soul for renewal. To be turned to stone was to be purified, broken down, made ready for the work of creation. Even the placement of Gorgon masks in temples may have carried a hidden geometry. Carved at doorways, staring from pediments, they acted as guardians of thresholds. Sacred architecture often encoded cosmic order in its very design, and the Gorgon's face may have been part of that code, a seal against chaos, a reminder that the sacred could only be entered by those prepared to confront terror and survive it. There are echoes of this across cultures. In Egypt, initiates faced the terrifying forms of underworld deities before passing into eternal life. In Mesopotamia, descent myths placed heroes before monstrous beings who guarded the way to hidden knowledge. To cross the threshold, one had to endure the face of fear. Medusa was the Greek expression of this universal ordeal, the horror that transforms, the terror that purifies. It is no accident that Perseus, the hero who beheaded her, survives in myth not only as a warrior but as a figure who has seen what others cannot. By using reflection to face her, he enacted in story what initiates enacted in ritual, the indirect confrontation with truths too powerful to look at directly. He carried away not just her head, but the secret that horror itself can be turned into wisdom, that fear itself is the doorway to transformation. And so, Medusa lived not only in stories of blood and battle, but also in the dimly lit halls of initiation, where seekers came trembling to the threshold of mystery. To meet her was to die a little, and to be reborn into something greater. Art through the ages, from monster to beauty. If Medusa lived in the rituals and the shadows of myth, she also lived in the hands of artists. From the first crude carvings on temple stones to the paintings of Renaissance masters, her face was redrawn, reshaped, and reimagined across centuries. Each generation looked at her anew, and each time she became a mirror for what that age feared, desired, or sought to control. The earliest Medusas, from the archaic period of Greece, were monstrous in every sense. Wide eyes bulging, mouth stretched in a grimace, tusks jutting like those of a boar. These faces were not meant to seduce or charm, they were weapons. To carve her on a temple or a shield was to broadcast terror. Beauty had no place in her first image. What mattered was her power to repel. But as the centuries passed, her features began to soften. By the classical era, artists were no longer content with the grotesque. The human form, idealized and perfected, had become the measure of beauty, and even Medusa could not escape that aesthetic. Her face became more human, less monstrous, her features almost tragic. The snakes still coiled, but the fangs were gone. She was still dangerous, but now she was also sorrowful, even alluring. It was as though the artists themselves felt a pang of sympathy for her, or perhaps a fascination with the possibility that terror and beauty might not be opposites, but two sides of the same coin. The Hellenistic period pushed this tension further. Sculptors and painters reveled in contrasts, and Medusa became an icon of dangerous allure. Her eyes were wide, but not only in rage, they seemed to hold grief, even longing. Her mouth was parted not in a scream, but in something closer to breath. The monster was dissolving into a woman, the woman into a symbol. When the Romans took up her image, they multiplied it. Medusa's head appeared on mosaics, frescoes, jewelry, even floor tiles, sometimes grotesque, sometimes exquisite. In villas and bathhouses, she looked up from the stone beneath your feet, her gaze still protective, but now also decorative, woven into the very fabric of daily life. Then came the Renaissance, and with it, the rebirth of classical myths into a world of new anxieties and ambitions. Caravaggio painted Medusa's head as freshly severed, blood still spilling, her eyes locked in the instant of death and horror. But there is also something else in that painting, a reflection of the artist himself, for he painted his own face onto the warrior who stared back from her features. In that moment, Medusa became not only a monster, but an allegory of tyranny, of violence turned back upon itself. She was no longer just the victim of the gods, she was the mirror of power's brutality. In Baroque sculpture, she appeared again, most famously in the work of Cellini, whose bronze Perseus raises her head aloft. Yet even in this image of conquest, her face is strangely serene, almost beautiful, as though the artist could not help but grant her dignity in defeat. Neoclassical and Romantic artists carried this further, turning her into a symbol of sublime terror, the fascination with what is beautiful because it terrifies, what is irresistible because it destroys. By the time we reach the modern era, Medusa's image has splintered. To some, she is still the monster of old, stamped on fashion logos and comic books, her head a symbol of raw power. To others, she is tragic beauty, a woman wronged and misunderstood. In art, she has been everything from grotesque to goddess, from talisman to muse. And in each transformation, she reflects the age that drew her. For the archaic Greeks, she was horror itself. For the classicists, a tragic figure. For the Renaissance, a political allegory. For us, perhaps, she is something else entirely, an icon of resistance, a face reclaimed from the past. Medusa in art is proof of her immortality. Though the hero's blade fell, though her head was carried away, her image never stopped shifting. She is not fixed in stone. She is alive in paint, in bronze, in marble, her face waiting to tell us not just who she was, but who we are when we look at her. Power, politics, and patriarchy. Every myth carries with it the weight of politics, and Medusa's is no exception. She was not simply a creature of stories told around the fire. She was also a symbol reshaped by those who held power, and through her we can see how myth was used to control, to warn, and to redefine the boundaries of who held authority. There are scholars who argue that Medusa was once linked to far older goddess traditions, long before the Olympians established their order. In fragments of pre-Greek cultures, snake women and earth mothers appear as symbols of fertility and sovereignty. Some whisper that Medusa herself may have once been a vestige of this matriarchal power, a guardian figure later demonized as the patriarchal pantheon took hold. It would not be the first time in history that a goddess became a monster when new rulers rewrote the story. When the Olympians dominated the stage, Medusa became their cautionary tale. She was mortal among immortals, vulnerable yet cursed, and her fall confirmed the hierarchy of gods over all other powers. When Perseus cut off her head, it was more than a hero's triumph, it was a symbol of Olympian control over the older, darker forces of chaos. The message was clear. The old feminine powers, untamed and terrifying, had no place in the new order except as defeated relics. This same pattern reappeared in Rome, where Medusa's story was molded to reflect Roman values. In Ovid's version, her beauty invited violation, her punishment was to become monstrous, and her fate was to be slain by a hero who would go on to serve kings. The narrative echoed Roman laws where women's bodies were sites of control, their honor defined by the state and their blame carried even when wronged. Medusa became not only a monster but a warning, a story that encoded power into morality. Later ages took this political use further. In Christian writings, Medusa was cast as a symbol of pagan evil, her serpent hair aligned with the devil himself, her petrifying gaze turned into an allegory for sin. She was invoked in sermons as a reminder of lust, temptation, and false gods. The Gorgon face that once guarded temples was now used as proof of heresy and the dangers of feminine power outside church authority. Even in the Middle Ages and Renaissance, she was never just a mythological curiosity. Medusa appeared in allegories and emblems, often as a political warning. Tyrants were compared to her. Enemies of the state were branded with her image. She became shorthand for the chaos that power claimed to protect its people from. Yet in the same breath, her image was carried on coats of arms, on city gates, on military banners, still a guardian, still a shield, though now bent to new masters. And here is the paradox. Medusa was always a mirror for power itself. To those who ruled, she was the monster that justified control, the danger that only heroes or kings could overcome. To those who resisted, she was a face of the oppressed, a figure whose wrongs revealed the cruelty of the system. Even today, this double life continues. Some see her as a symbol of female rage, others as an emblem of violence turned back on itself. Her power lies not in being one thing, but in being whatever the politics of the moment need her to be. In the end, Medusa's story is inseparable from the structures that retold it. She was guardian, goddess, monster, and warning, each mask fitted to the face of authority. But behind all those retellings lies the faint outline of something older, a figure of power that frightened precisely because it could not be contained. Perhaps that is why her gaze still unsettles us. It is not just the stare of a mythic creature, it is the look of suppressed power, the silent reminder that what is cast down is never truly gone. Medusa in psychology and psychoanalysis. For centuries, Medusa was drawn on shields and carved in stone, but in the modern age her image shifted once again from myth and politics into the hidden corners of the human mind. Psychologists and psychoanalysts began to see in her not just a monster from legend, but a symbol of the fears and desires that shape us all. Sigmund Freud was among the first to write about her in these terms. To him, Medusa's head was the very picture of castration anxiety, the primal terror a boy feels when confronted with the power of the female body. The snakes, writhing and alive, he saw as symbols of male sexuality, sprouting in panic where power felt threatened. The petrifying gaze, in Freud's reading, was the shock of fear so deep it paralyzed the body. For him, Medusa was not just a myth but an archetype of male anxiety, a mirror of the dread that haunts desire. Carl Jung, on the other hand, looked beyond fear into the broader landscape of the psyche. To him, Medusa was the shadow, the part of ourselves we repress, deny, or fear to acknowledge. Her face was the image of everything buried, everything disowned. To look upon her was to be frozen not because she killed, but because she showed us the truth we refused to see. The hero's task, in Jung's terms, was not to destroy her but to confront her, to integrate the shadow and be made whole. Perseus with his mirror was the psyche reflecting upon itself, turning terror into knowledge. In more recent times, psychologists have linked Medusa's power to trauma. The freeze response, one of the body's primal defenses against threat, is a modern echo of being turned to stone. Victims of violence, shock, or terror often describe the sensation of paralysis, as though their bodies abandoned them. Medusa's gaze is no longer just a mythic curse, it is a metaphor for the way fear lives in our nervous system, how the mind can lock us in stillness when escape is impossible. there is also the dimension of beauty and horror entwined. In art, Medusa is often depicted as both alluring and deadly, her features human yet framed by serpents. Psychologists see in this the tension between attraction and fear, desire and danger, the dangerous fascination of what we should not want but cannot look away from. She is the embodiment of the ambivalence that runs through human experience. The thing that terrifies us most is often the thing we are drawn toward. Medusa in psychology becomes not a relic of the past but a language for the inner world. She is anxiety, shadow, trauma, fascination. She is the frozen place inside us that waits to be acknowledged, the buried power that can paralyze or transform. And when we see her this way, the old story of Perseus takes on new meaning. To face her indirectly, to use the shield's reflection, is to recognize that sometimes we cannot confront our fears head-on. We need distance, mediation, symbols. We must approach the unbearable sideways until we are strong enough to hold its gaze. And yet, even in these modern interpretations, her power remains intact. Whether in Freud's clinic, Jung's archetypes, or the language of trauma theory, Medusa's eyes still stare back at us from the darkened corners of the mind. She is proof that myths never die. They simply find new places to live. In stone once, in psyche now, always in the places where fear makes us still. Feminist and political reclamation. If the ancients feared Medusa and the psychologists turned her into a symbol of the unconscious, then the modern world has done something different still. It has reclaimed her. No longer just the monster on a shield or the shadow in a dream, Medusa has become an emblem of defiance, a banner raised by those who refuse to accept silence or blame. In the 20th century, feminist thinkers began to look at her story with fresh eyes. Writers like Hélène Cixous argued that Medusa was never a figure of horror at all, but a woman distorted by a patriarchal lens. In her famous essay, The Laugh of the Medusa, Cixous insists that when we truly look at her, she is laughing, not screaming. She is not the cursed victim of Poseidon's assault or Athena's punishment, but a figure of vitality and freedom, a symbol of female creativity and power that male-dominated cultures could only render monstrous. Artists followed. Painters, sculptors, and writers reimagined Medusa not as a head severed by Perseus, but as a survivor, her snakes no longer a punishment but a crown. Some portrayed her with steady eyes that dared the viewer to look away, others with a kind of sacred beauty that turned the old terror into reverence. Where once her face froze men in fear, now it inspired women to see themselves not as victims but as wielders of power long denied. Her image began appearing in political spaces too. In the 1970 seconds and beyond, Medusa was embraced by activists protesting violence against women. Placards and posters carried her likeness, her story used to highlight the injustice of victim blaming that had shadowed her myth since Ovid's time. She became a reminder that silence could be broken, that rage could be voiced, that those wronged could turn their suffering into strength. Even in pop culture, her image has been reclaimed. From the Versace logo, which turned her head into a mark of prestige and allure, to modern films and novels where she is recast as a tragic heroine rather than a monster, Medusa has become shorthand for female power in all its forms: dangerous, creative, indomitable. Each retelling chips away at the old narrative of victimhood and reshapes her into a figure of agency. There is something almost poetic about this reversal. The face once feared as destruction now appears as a symbol of survival. The myth once told to warn women of their place is now told to remind them of their power. Medusa's gaze, once cursed, has been turned outward again, not to paralyze, but to confront the systems that sought to control her story. She is a survivor painted in serpents, a muse of rage and renewal, a mirror for every time society has tried to make women carry the shame of crimes committed against them. And perhaps that is why she resonates so strongly now, because in reclaiming Medusa, modern voices are not just rewriting a myth, They are exposing a truth that was there from the beginning, that she was never the monster at all, but the reminder that power, once suppressed, has a way of returning. The monster that was a mirror. We have followed Medusa from the salt-dark depths of her primordial origins to the walls of temples, from the cave where Perseus lifted his mirrored shield to the canvases of Renaissance masters, from the clinics of Freud and Jung to the protests of modern streets. And through it all, her face has never stayed the same. She has been a guardian, a victim, a monster, a muse, and a symbol of rebellion. But perhaps the most unsettling truth is that Medusa was never really any of these things on her own. She was always a mirror. Every age looked at her and saw what it most feared, or what it most needed. To the archaic Greeks, she was terror wielded as protection, the grotesque made sacred to keep chaos away. To the Romans, she was the woman blamed for her own assault, turned into an object of punishment to reinforce law and order. To philosophers, she was the unbearable truth that froze the soul. To artists, she was the paradox of beauty and horror entwined. To psychoanalysts, she was the shape of unconscious fear. To feminists, she was the survivor whose gaze refuses to bow. This is why her story endures. Not because of what she was, but because of what we see when we look at her. She is the face of chaos to those who worship order. She is the face of danger to those who fear female power. She is the face of trauma to those who have lived it, and she is the face of defiance to those who will not be silenced. Each retelling is less about Medusa herself than about the culture holding the pen. And so perhaps the most dangerous part of her myth is not her snakes or her eyes, but the question she leaves us with. What do we see when we look at her? Do we see the monster who must be slain, or the victim who must be avenged? Do we see the guardian who protects us, or the power that frightens us because it cannot be controlled? Maybe the true horror was never Medusa's face at all. Maybe it was the way each age chose to twist her, to use her, to reflect its own fears back upon itself. And if that is the case, then Medusa is not gone. She is still here, waiting in every mirror, every story, every moment when we flinch from what we do not want to face. She is the reminder that the line between beauty and terror, between protection and destruction, is thinner than we care to admit. The monster was never the point. The mirror was, and when we look into it, we might just find that the face staring back at us is our own.